Good morning, and thank you for coming to my presentation for the paper Validating SAREF in a Smart Home Environment. It was written by myself, Victor de Boer, Laura, Daniele, and Barry Nouwt. Let's start with a quick introduction about the Internet of Things. The goal of the Internet of Things is to connect devices to each other by connecting them to the Internet. And this allows, for example, to connect your phone to your doorbell so you can see who rings your doorbell, or it allows your dishwasher to connect to your alarm clock so the dishes will be done before you wake up. IoT is very popular with manufacturers at the moment, resulting in a lot of smart devices created by multiple manufacturers. Unfortunately, devices from different manufacturers don't communicate with each other as well as one would want. They are often locked into using specific apps that don't allow devices from different manufacturers, or they simply use different formats and different languages to communicate their information. In order to resolve this, multiple ontologies have been proposed to work as a central model. The information of the devices can be translated, and the information then can be translated towards the new devices, which means that a lot less translation is required to get the devices to work together. One of these ontologies is the SAREF ontology, which started development in 2013, and it has been validated before in the past, but not on how well it can be used as a practical implementation, which this paper focuses on. This paper validates the SAREF ontology on its practical implementation by creating two implementations of the SAREF ontology. The first being a mapping of data from a smart home to a knowledge graph using SAREF. The second one explores data sharing between different devices using an interoperability framework. But let's first look at a small description of SAREF. SAREF started as a collaboration between the European Commission and ETSI. It was proposed as a shared model that could enable the communication between IoT devices from different manufacturers that use different protocols and standards. The SAREF consists of a modular framework that uses one core ontology and 10 domain-specific extensions, which range from an energy extension to an automotive extension, allowing for the core ontology to remain as general as possible. This is a visualization of the SAREF core ontology. The starting point is the device class. Every device has a task, and to accomplish this task, it performs a function. So, for example, a thermometer would have a SAREF sensor for its device class, and a SAREF comfort for its task, and SAREF sensing function for its function. The value of the measurement would be stored in a SAREF measurement class, and the measurement is of a SAREF feature of interest, which can be any real-world entity such as a room or a person. A more elaborate example will follow later in one of the implementations. Not all devices require all the classes. A sensor doesn't need a command, and a smart switch doesn't need a measurement. But the core is a general depiction of a device, so it contains all of these. SAREF isn't the only ontology. Other ontologies have different focuses, such as the SSN ontology that focuses more on observing sensors, or the W3C thing descriptions ontology that focuses more on the metadata of devices instead of the measurements that can be made by them or the commands that can be sent to them. Which brings us to the first implementation. The goal of the implementation is to map the information from the data sources retrieved from a smart home to a knowledge graph using SAREF. This is successful if we can model all the information from the data sources with SAREF without having to leave anything out. We started with 33 data sources, but many were duplicates in different rooms. Removing the duplicates leaves us with these 9 data sources. They can be seen with the units the data uses. Most of them speak for themselves. Only the first time movement detected and last time movement detected are a bit non-descriptive. They can be easiest interpreted as the starting point and the end point of a time frame in which movement is detected in a specific room. For this presentation, we only do one of the devices as an example, which is the current temperature measurement. As can be seen, we don't need all classes for this device, only those related to the measurement. The template of the mapping shows how the measurements will be encoded in RDF. The angle brackets are URI placeholders, and the curly brackets are placeholders for the input from the measurements. The other classes that are used are also clarified here. So, for example, the property class is of SAREF temperature, and the unit of measure is a temperature unit. To sum up this implementation, this was pretty straightforward for all the data sources that were available, except for the humidity and the CO2, because those didn't have a unit of measure available in the SAREF Ontology, but those were easily added, which is one of the main points of the SAREF Ontology, that it can be all-encompassing, that it has room for these additions to be made. Same goes for the CO2 data source that needed an extra SAREF property. Returning to the initial goal of this implementation, expressing all the information of the data sources available in a smart home using SAREF, this was possible with the exception of the mentioned cases which were remedied. So we continue with the next implementation, which is sharing data with SAREF. The goal of this implementation is to achieve interoperability between devices with the use of SAREF, meaning we want to make multiple devices communicate using data that was modeled with SAREF. For this to work, SAREF needs to be expressive enough to not lose any of the information of the data during the communication. To test this, we used an interoperability framework, specifically the knowledge engine, to implement a scenario of a real-life situation where multiple devices need to communicate. The scenario is that we use 3 devices: a thermometer that measures the current temperature of the room, a thermostat that knows the target temperature of the room, and a heat source that controls the input of the heat to a room. The scenario is that we want the thermostat to use the information of the thermometer to decide whether it should send a command to the heat source to turn up the heat. Based on this scenario, we formulated the following 3 competency questions that must be communicated correctly for the scenario to be successfully finished. What is the temperature of a specific room? Is it higher or lower than the threshold temperature, the target temperature? And should the heater be turned on or off? Okay, back to the knowledge engine. The knowledge engine doesn't allow devices to directly communicate messages to each other. Instead, it adds a so-called smart connector to every smart device that sends and receives all the information of the devices, which the smart connector can then share with other smart connectors communicating its messages in RDF. Whenever a new smart connector is added to the system, it is registered at the service directory and shares its capability descriptions, which shares the information it's able to supply and the information that it wants to receive. The service directory uses this information to connect the smart connectors with each other to facilitate these supplies and demands. In our implementation, it looked like this. 3 Raspberry Pis were used as smart connectors, and the service directory ran on a separate laptop. The thermometer measured the temperature, the thermostat had buttons that altered the target temperature, and the heater had a LED light that burns when the heater is on. The supply and demand descriptions from the smart connectors were sent to the service directory, which arranged the thermometer to send its messages to the thermostat, and the thermostat to send its messages to the heater, which looked like this. For a room named Room 1, the temperature is 18 degrees. The thermostat calculates that this is lower than the target temperature, so sends an on command to the heater, which starts to shine, which means that all the competency questions are able to be answered. because the temperature was correctly communicated and compared to the target temperature, resulting in the specific command being sent to the heater. Returning to the goals we set for this implementation, we can backtrack to see if they were all accomplished. We were able to provide a practical implementation of devices communicating knowledge expressed using SAREF. SAREF was expressive enough to communicate knowledge between devices, at least within this scenario, which means we also successfully achieved interoperability between devices with the use of SAREF. In conclusion, the goal of the paper was to validate the practical implementation of SAREF by creating two implementations. For the first, we successfully created a template for each data source for my smart home. And for the second, we successfully completed a scenario where data modeled with SAREF was communicated between different devices. Thank you.